with us, but let's move to Representative Jim Himes, who is the ranking member of the Select Committee on Intelligence. It's great to have Jim here. He is a good friend, and he is joining us. He's got a heart out, so I want to make sure I get Jim's views on this. And Jim, let me just start out. I'm going to ask a political question. Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, many people thought stepped forward, supported the aid package to Ukraine as well to Israel, Gaza, Taiwan, and so on. And members of both parties supported his remaining in state. He was not, the motion to vacate did not proceed. And I'm just interested, are we back to a moment where maybe politics ends at water's edge, or do these issues remain highly divisive between the parties? Jim?
School protests.
Yeah, Steve, thank you for having me. No, sadly, I wish I could report that we're back to a moment where politics ends at the water's edge, but no, very much it does not. And we see this every week on Codels, particularly as we go into November, particularly as the Republicans sort of sharpen their attack.
So when you talk about Codels, you mean split Codels not going together, or?
No. I mean, when, every week when these delegations return, press reports are of, what used to be sort of a violation of the norms, which is, Republicans attacking President Biden, Democrats, talking about their fears around the possibility of a President Trump. So the answer to your question is no. We remain massively polarized. And what has happened is that, particularly now, remember that where I work in the House, the Republicans are in a majority, so they're the party that matters. If you think about that Ukraine vote, every single Democrat, and it's split roughly 50-50, as you know, the Republicans have whatever it is, a 2-vote majority, but every single Democrat voted in support of Ukraine aid, whereas the Republicans were split in half. And I heard you say that Adam Kinzinger, I have thoughts on why that is, but Adam Kinzinger, who lived inside the Republican conference, that's where the isolationist movement lives today. And we need to grapple with that, because what has happened is there's articles about how we've sort of established a centrist governing coalition, sort of, right? I mean, if the alternative is handing the keys to Marjorie Taylor Greene or the extreme elements, to passing a budget, to actually getting a package of aid done, we will choose the latter. But it is very much on a razor's edge with respect to, and frankly, that razor's edge is, just as you accurately point out, how much internal dissent in the Republican majority can Speaker Johnson handle?
I'm going to do something unusual here, because my friend Bill Galston is on from Brookings, very prominent voice in all sorts of policy issues, but he has a hard stop when you do. Let me bring Bill Galston on for a moment, Naharika. I want him to ask this great question and give him credit for it. Bill, you with us? Well, I'm going to ask Bill's question. Okay, great. Bill, go ahead, Bill.
I think I'm unmuted now. This is all very interesting, but with the immediate crisis in Ukraine, the issue is numbers. This is a war.
Let's do short form, Bill.
Yep. Yeah. Can't substitute quality for quantity. Russia is now on a war footing, producing 3 million 155 millimeter shells per year.
And started with 14 million at the beginning. They had 14 million at the beginning of the conflict. Yeah.
Okay. And the EU and the US together can't get close to that number and are not on track to do so. What can we do about that?
Great. Jim, I'd love to get that, because these number games issues is something that Senator Vance had raised as well. But how do we basically deal with that dimension of production asynchronicities between what you need in these kinds of conflicts? And does it leave the United States in a way? This has been some of the criticisms of Mike McCall and others. Do we leave ourselves in a deficit in the United States, and are other nations a deficit because we've basically offloaded so much to Ukraine?
Yeah, good question, and good to see you, Bill. Look, I think it's a terrible mistake to say that the numbers are determinative. Anybody who has ever fought a conflict will tell you that, yes, numbers really do matter, but they're not determinative. Just to give you an example that applies to Ukraine, there is a radical adjustment that must be made to the numbers calculation when you are defending your homeland with the support of the world versus, participating in a corrupt invasion of someone else's homeland. That matters. That really matters. It is also true that, and again, I'm not in any way dismissing the importance of numbers. I'm just making the point that it is a factor. It is also true that qualitative considerations are not absent in Ukraine. The intelligence sharing that we are doing, this is my world, right, in the intelligence community, the intelligence sharing that we are doing in Ukraine is not something that the Russians can replicate. One ally handing intelligence to the other. So I wouldn't, Bill's point remains. And frankly, it's not just about 155 artillery shells. It's also fundamentally about the fact that a system has developed in which primarily China, but also India, are feeding the Russian economy by buying very cheap oil and gas. And that is providing the resources necessary for the Russians to operate. And so why do I say all that? I say all that because we cannot fix the fact that Russia has a dramatically larger population of military-age males than Ukraine. But we can continue to work on the Chinese and the Indians, as difficult as that task may seem. And we can continue to emphasize those areas where there are qualitative differences. Intelligence sharing, by the way, one thing I would highlight, because it's been lighting my hair on fire this week.
Right.
I compliment the president for doing what we need to do, but we need to do more than what we need to do. We need to finally get to the battlefield, not a day late, right? And 90 of us wrote a letter to the president saying we've really got to lean into this a little bit more. We're not going to see a wing of F-16s flying on Moscow, but we absolutely need to permit the Ukrainians to take out the artillery that they have stationed around Belgorod that is now operating with impunity because we have a restriction on the use of our weaponry over the Russian border. So I wouldn't dismiss the importance of numbers, but it's just one factor in how this plays out.
But go back and Jim, please restate that, because I think what you've been an advocate of, which is removing, part of the question that I've had since the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, which the United States had phenomenal intelligence on at the time, but what was the sense that the White House's fear of escalation, of arming Ukraine with weapons that it would have under control that could drive an escalation. And there was a sense, and I remember, frankly, last year at Leonard Mary conference in Estonia, that America was driving this to a frozen conflict. Do you believe that that's what the White House was doing? And now you're advocating a change in position and want those, essentially constraints removed?
Well, Steve, let's give the White House credit. First of all, they're the ones responsible for making sure, not the legislature, they're the ones responsible for making sure that this does not spiral into a
But I just want to say,
war.
you're calling for a change in policy, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm calling for, the lifting of the restrictions of the use of American weapons in a conditioned way. Again, I don't want F-16s flying towards Moscow, but I absolutely do want ATACMS used to take out the artillery that is stationed just 15 miles over there, or whatever it is, 10 miles over the Ukrainian border. But Steve, strategically speaking, you can't blame the White House for initially being cautious, right? This is something that we did not anticipate, that we'd never seen before, the possibility of a Russian attack on a NATO country. Where are the red lines? What's happening? We've been at this for a little while. And I'll give you my opinion, but I think it's backed by the sort of analysis of the American government. Putin is, except for in the most extreme circumstances of the threat of regime change, not going to use a nuclear weapon. The Chinese have been very clear about what happens if he does that. Number two, he is not anytime soon going to invade a NATO country. And we learned that long ago. And so what I fear didn't happen is absolutely in the first 2-3 months of this, we should have been enormously cautious because no red lines had been drawn. We had no real sense of Russian capabilities, et cetera, et cetera. We're now in a world where the question is, 10 years from now, will the story be that the West did what it needed to do to reverse an attack on the rules-based order, or did it not? And to date, the answer has only been kind of 60%. And so we really need to lean into this, learning what we have learned in the last couple of months.
But look, Jim, two quick things, and I want to mention I know you have a hard stop in 4 minutes. Adam Kinzinger has joined us. Great to see you, Adam. We'll have him on in just a moment. I have two really big. We have the NATO summit coming up in July in Washington, D.C. It's going to be an interesting moment, because it's an election year. You've got NATO summit here in Washington. Will be interesting to see what former President Trump says about that. But I can hear embedded in your comments while you are debating the National Defense Authorization Act this year, whether or not there is a kind of incrementalism as we're thinking about defense priorities, or whether there needs to be a strategic leap. And the thing going on in the back of my mind, and I can hear it in your comments, is whether America, if it hadn't come through with the Ukraine aid package, I'm interested, is there going to be a Suez crisis moment for the perception of US leadership in the world? And are we running the risk, if we don't get some of these alignments right, where America can go from being a very big, important power with a lot of mystique to one that, like the UK in the 1950s, all of a sudden becomes quite diminished?
Steve, we're not becoming diminished anytime soon. And I could quote, we were talking numbers earlier, there's 7,000 satellites orbiting the Earth right now. About half of them are ours, right? I mean, we've got 11 or 12
so we've got
carrier strike
capacity.
groups. I mean, I could keep naming numbers. And so, no, we're not anywhere close to being a diminished 1960s, post-imperial Great Britain. We have some very severe internal fights happening, some of which are rooted in American traditional isolationism, some of which are unique to Donald Trump and what he happens to think about Ukraine on any given day. Adam Kinzinger will be best able to talk about that stuff. But so we've got that to deal with. Frankly, NATO is a pretty amazing story in the last year or so, right? Putin, in his wildest imagination, never imagined that Germany would be dedicating itself to the 2%. Never imagined, that Sweden and Finland would join. What needs to happen now, in my humble opinion, is, and I think this is consistent with some interesting comments that President Macron has made, both for its own sake, but also for American political reasons. Europe really needs to develop its defense industrial base, right? I mean, you can put forward units, et cetera, but Europe really, in some combined or fragmented way, really needs to develop its own defense industrial base. Without that, somebody like Donald Trump is always going to be able to say they are freeloaders. And as much as I don't particularly appreciate that point of view, and I would never use that language, the man's not entirely wrong. We're moving to a world in which most European countries will get to the 2% of GDP in spending, but that's certainly not where we were 5 years ago.
Right. 1 minute, Jim. Is our intelligence capacity as good as Russia's?
It's far better, Steve. Far better.
Do we use it as muscularly as Russia?
Well, it's funny when you say muscularly. I'm not sure whether you mean. I mean, we operate our intelligence apparatus consistent with the enlightened ideas in the Constitution. So we don't turn it against political dissidents the way the Russians do. So your question is broad enough that it's hard for me to answer. But I will tell you that in that area we have a dramatic qualitative edge because of technology and competence. And we also have something that the Russians don't have yet with the Chinese, which is the Five Eyes, where our NATO partners in particular, but also the Five Eyes, are working together in a way that makes our activities more than the sum of the parts.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us, Representative Jim Hines, who's ranking member of the Select Committee on Intelligence. I know you've got a hard stop, and I'm going to bring your former GOP congressman to continue this conversation. So, Jim, thanks so much.